So for this first demonstration of getting into slabs, we're going to go over something really quickly that's called wedging. And wedging is where we're going to be taking clay, and it can be clay that you've already used in your bag that's wet enough. If it's not wet enough, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you kind of grab like your small sponge, maybe fill it up with water, put it into your bag and close it up inside of your bag until the next time you come into class. And then another thing that you can do is use that spray bottle and just kind of spritz inside of your clay bag so that way you can add some moisture into that clay. I've got some pieces that are in here that are left over, and I'm going to use those and kind of put them together. And the idea behind wedging is that wedging is going to take the air out of your clay. And so we want to take that air out of the clay because we don't want to have those air bubbles potentially that are in there. And when we're making a slab, we're actually going to be stretching out the clay. And when we do that, if there's an air bubble in there, it could potentially pop or it could potentially come out while we're doing it. And then it'll kind of stretch and rip the clay in the process. With those pinch pots, we're pinching so much as we're making them. You're compressing so much and you're just taking the clay directly off out of the bag. You don't really have those issues with it. So that's why we didn't go over wedging until coming into this slab process. But I've noticed a lot of students when they're attempting to make slabs, and I've had it happen to myself as well, that I'll see those kind of air bubbles emerge as I'm stretching out my slab or rolling out my slab, and then it becomes a potential problem. A little bit more when I'm stretching it rather than rolling, so I'm going to be showing you guys how to wedge first, and then we're going to go into how to roll out a slab, and also we're going to talk about how to stretch a slab by throwing it down on the ground, which is kind of one of my favorite methods. It makes a slab really quickly, and you don't need any tools to do it other than yourself and the clay. So that's what we're going to kind of go over. So we'll start with wedging. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just cut off a pretty good sized chunk of clay. When you wedge, you don't want to have a little tiny bit of clay. You don't want to have, like, for example, this little amount, right? If you have a tiny little amount like this, it's going to be really hard for you to do, because when you wedge, you want to be able to get the clay, a big chunk of clay in your hands. So we're talking about, I'm probably going to cut off the remainder of what we have here, maybe a little bit bigger than that. So also when we make a slab, we want to make a slab that's going to be big enough for us to stretch out and get a larger object. That's one of the beauties of slab building, is that we can make larger objects rather quickly, and it's kind of easier to have them stay together. So I've got a pretty good amount of clay. As always, you want to cover that up, make sure that it's off on the side, and the bag is closed so you're not losing moisture. All right. So now I've got this kind of bigger chunk right here. And the very first thing I'm going to do is just kind of use the table, and I'm going to kind of hit it to turn it kind of into a little bit more of a ball shape, right? Or a sphere or a cube, or just something that's not so long and strange shaped, right? You could even use your hands and kind of just pound it together to turn it into a ball. And just like when we make our pinch pots, we want to do this, and we want to have some force when we're doing that. You should see a physical dent start to happen in that piece of clay as we're doing that, okay? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and put it onto the table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my hands, all right? When I use these hands, I'm going to push this up a little bit real quick so I can show you. You can see myself. So I'm going to use my hands like this. And if you take your hands and kind of put them together like this, where they're almost in like the prayer position, but you want your arms to be kind of on an angle like this, not way down here, right? Like up like this. And what we're thinking about is the pressure that's right here on this part of our hand, right? The pad of our hand, not up here in the fingers. Our fingers don't do much at all in this process. So we want to use those pads. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm not pushing any pressure right now. I'm just touching my hands together barely. But then as I go down and start to push in towards this way, I want to start squeezing in and kind of getting some pressure, pushing towards my pads, those pads of my hands. And then I'm going to tilt those hands out this direction, away from me, and then I release that pressure. So the most amount of pressure is going to be in here in the center, right? And this is kind of like a breathe in, breathe out. It's kind of like a Zen thing, right, as we do this. So we want to go like this, right? Come in, increase the pressure as we come towards the center, release the pressure as we move it away from our bodies, okay? So that's kind of the feeling that you get when you're wedging. And then when you kind of come here and you do it, right, it's this ball of clay, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it and squeeze inward and then release as I go this way, okay? Then I'm going to, it makes a little bit of a ramp, right? A little bit of a hump here, okay? So then I'm going to lift it up and I'm going to put it about like here, right? Up on its end. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Hold inwards like this, kind of give a little bit of a squeeze and then push forward. You can see that right here there's lumps, right? These indentations. That's from the pad of my hand. And that pad of my hand should be applying the pressure. As you notice, there's no finger marks anywhere on the clay, right? I'm doing this rather slowly, and it's hard to do it slow. Normally, when I do this, I do it quite fast, and it's a learning process, right? And so you start to see all these weird things happening, right? And that's because the clay was misshapen when I first started out, right? But as we kind of go, we're going to be, it's going to start to look a little bit more so we're going to start to see all these like lumps and bumps that start to happen here, and they start to kind of get the same thickness that's happening, all right? And you start to see that this portion is starting to kind of look a little bit like a cylinder going this direction. And then if we look on this side of the clay, and I'll hold it a little closer to the camera, we start to see a spiral that happens here. This process is called skull wedging because it makes something that kind of looks a little bit like a cow's skull. This is essentially where maybe the horns would be connected, all right? So now I keep doing this, right? And I want to make sure that when I'm doing it, I'm holding in this way. I don't want my hands to go on top of the clay. When my hands go on top of the clay, what happens is this starts to spread out like a big long log. This part and this pressure holding in this direction and then pushing on this part of the pad, that helps keep it contained in this little area, right? And you'll start to see this little spot happen on the table, and that's from the moisture of the clay kind of coming out and going down into the table. So we do this. You can see how rather quickly I do it. I'm just lifting it up, right? Holding on the outsides, squeezing it down or pushing it down. And just like with that pinching of pinch pots, we want to do this rhythmically. And we do it rhythmically, it actually will be pushing the pressure the same time each and every time we do it. And if you look at this, now we can see that these are almost all the same size, right? Because of that rhythmic nature that I'm doing, okay? So that's how we wedge. Now, students ask, how many times do I have to wedge in order for it to get all the air bubbles out? There's no answer to that. It's like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they found out the meaning to life was 42 or whatever, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't mean anything. If you're doing this wrong and you do it 250,000 times, then it's still going to be wrong and you're still going to have air, right? So as long as these are folding over on themselves kind of naturally, and they're not folding over so much that it's trapping more air, because sometimes that's what students do. And when people are first learning how to wedge, they actually start to do that, and they start to fold the clay over onto itself and put more air bubbles into it. That's not what we want to do, okay? So I kind of have a number in my head that I do, and my number is like, if it's fresh out of the bag clay like this, I'll maybe wedge it, 40 to 50 times to kind of make sure that all the clay, because what the clay's doing is it's coming from the inside and moving itself from that to the outside. So it's kind of working through all of this clay and getting it to where we need it, okay? And pushing any air bubbles out. And on occasion, you'll hear a little pops. And when you hear the little pops, or feel the little pops even too, because you'll kind of, if it's loud in here, you won't be able to hear it. You'll actually feel it in your hand like a little pop. And then you know that some air bubbles are popping. If you never feel that, that's okay. That just means there's no air in your clay, right? Or they were so small that they didn't really make any sort of a feeling or any sort of an audible noise, all right? Then what we do at the end is we kind of just roll it over onto itself, to turn it into kind of like this, where we get rid of those little lumps and bumps that we had before. We still see the spiralness that's happening here on the edge. And what I do is I take that and put it on the table and just give it a little spin like that. Same thing on the other side. And now it's really close to that ball shape that we need. And so what I'm going to do now is hit that clay, get it closer to more of a round shape, if you will. Okay? And now that piece is ready to be made into an object. Just like our pinch pots, we want to look around and make sure we've pounded it to make it as, pretty round, but also we don't want to see folds or any marks or anything on the clay. Sound good? That's wedging. All right, so method number one is we're going to roll this thing out on the table. So we've got this nice area. I may be a little bit concerned right now because this has this wet spot from when I was wedging. Sometimes if it's too wet in this one region and I go to start rolling it out, essentially what could happen is that the clay may stick to this area. So we want to have a kind of a drier surface. And if I wait a little bit longer, that surface will go away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you kind of the tools that we're going to be using on this before and while we're waiting for this to kind of go away a little bit. We have thickness strips. So these thickness strips are mostly used to make a pretty thin piece of clay. Most of the ones we have here in class, they're over by the plaster and the boards in the class area. They're going to be on this kind of thinner side. It's about 1/4 of an inch. That's about as thin as we want to go to make a slab. Anything thinner than that, it's going to be really hard to handle, okay, and hard to score and slip and get everything together and have it actually stay upright. For some larger objects, we might go around 3/8, and we'll be able to do that by throwing the piece out on the floor when I get to that part. So these thickness strips, we basically set them on the table, and we want to make sure that depending on what rolling pin we use, we've got smaller rolling pins and longer rolling pins. The longer one rests on these thickness strips. That's what we want to have happen, okay? If I use this smaller one right now, it doesn't fit on there, right? So this is for making smaller slabs or thinner, longer slabs like this direction. You'd have to move them closer so that way the rolling pin touches the thickness strips. We want it to roll out the clay, but we also don't want it to roll out so thin. We want to try and get a very homogeneous thickness to our piece that we're making. So this smaller rolling pin may not work, okay? Now, when we get the rolling pins from the other area too, sometimes they have some clay left over from the last terrible human being that used this because they didn't clean it before they put it away, right? There's a couple of ways that we can clean that. There's a right way and a wrong way, right? This one even has some marks on there. What you want to do, because this is wood, you want to use a wooden tool to clean it off. You don't want to use a metal tool. If we use a metal tool, it starts scraping away the wood. This tool right here, I can go and find these little areas where there's a little bit of clay and just kind of scrape it off. Now, some people might ask, well, why don't you just go over to this sink and sponge it and get it wet? Well, if I get it wet, then it's probably going to stick to the clay a little bit more, all right? Maybe not that much, but if you have the time, you could clean it off with the sponge and then kind of set it aside until it doesn't look like it's wet any longer, and then that would be okay to do, all right? So I'm going to use the longer one because we're going to make a bigger slab, so I'm going to make these a little bit further apart. Now I'm going to take this first piece of clay that I made for you guys, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to throw it down onto the table, all right? So I want it to expand, right, and kind of start to come out here. And then what I can do is I can use my hand. I'm using this part of my hand, right? I'm not using my whole palm like this because my fingers aren't going to do much to this. So I want to really kind of come in here and do this and start hitting it down to the surface. And once I smack it down pretty good like that, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to lift it up every now and then, right? And maybe even turn it over and find maybe another spot where it's not so wet, right? And then do the same thing. We want this to be a little bit like, I don't know, maybe about 1 inch thick before we start rolling it. We don't want to start rolling it when it's this big lump here. It's too hard for us to get that rolling pin on there and figure it all out. Plus, if you do this, that just gets you a little bit better of having the sensitivity to the clay and knowing how to touch it and how hard we have to hit it as we're doing these things, okay? So now I've got it to about that, maybe an inch thick. So I'm gonna take it now and I'm gonna put it back where there's a little bit less of that water, okay? Get those thickness strips where we want them. And now I'm gonna take this rolling pin and I'm gonna start pushing down. And this type of a rolling pin, I've gotta really kind of twist it with my hands right now. Like I have to, almost like I'm, I don't know, what's this, like you're revving an engine on a motorcycle, right? And then once it gets a little bit less, then I can just kind of apply pressure with my flat hand like this and kind of start to move it. You gotta really lean your body weight into it. Don't be sitting in your chair when you do this. If you're sitting in your chair, you're not allowing your body weight to help you out. And you're gonna be like, Brian, how come I can't roll this dang thing out? And it's because you gotta use body weight to do it. Now, if I want my slab to be wider than this, I haven't come down to the thickness strips yet. If I want it to be wider than this, then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take it and lift it up and be very careful. Large amounts of surface area. Don't use your fingers like this to grab it, like claws. Use it like this, right? So that way you're not manipulating it. And sometimes we can even move it over a little bit because that's quite a wet spot that's happening there, right? And then I do it a quarter of a turn, right? And if I do it a quarter of a turn, now I can start to stretch it out this way, and then I can get more of a round kind of a slab. And a slab of clay is just like it sounds. It's just a sheet, essentially, of clay. And it's kind of like using, if you're a woodworker, using plywood rather than a big chunk of wood that you're gonna turn a bowl or something on a lathe, right? These are long sheets, or it's not like lumber. This is more like lumber, little strips. Now, as we do this, and we start to roll this thing out, or finish rolling this thing out, I should say, eventually it'll get to a point where it touches the thickness strips, and you can feel it in your hands, right? As you're doing this, you're rolling it out, and it kind of feels soft, and then all of a sudden, you'll feel it on your hands. You'll be like, oh, it feels like it's on the table, right? Or it's hitting something hard. And that's when you know that you've gotten to that point where you've got all the way down to the thickness strips. The rolling pin itself will start to get a little bit on the wet side. And you'll maybe notice it once you get to the ends of your slab as you're rolling this out, that it'll maybe start sticking to the rolling pin. Set it aside for a second, let that rolling pin get a little bit more dry, and then you'll be okay, all right? So I've gone pretty thin so far. I'm gonna lift it up one more time just to make sure that it's not gonna stick to the table surface. I'm gonna move over a little bit, and I'm gonna twist it, all right? You can even take this and turn it over, right? We can turn things over onto themselves and get to the other side, essentially. And now I can feel it on my hands that I'm touching those thickness strips. And as I roll, I can also look at the clay and notice that I'm not leaving any more marks on the clay. Okay, so I've got this ball of clay that we wedged before. Remember that anytime we're doing our slab stuff, we're gonna wanna wedge our clay before we get started, right? Otherwise, we're gonna get kind of rips and tears and things that maybe potentially happen, or if there's any air bubbles in the clay, then we'll start to see them essentially stretch and kind of destroy the slab. So this is a second method for making a slab. This is my preferred method for making a slab. I don't mind doing the rollout on the table, but this one, to me, it goes a lot faster. And once you learn the technique, then it's gonna be a little bit easier for you to make pretty big slabs that are relatively the same thickness. A lot of times I use the table method, rolling out with the rolling pin, I use that if I want to get a super consistent thickness of the slab. This one will get a little bit where you have some thick spots and some thin spots, but it's not so much that it's going to translate into your piece having any issues in the kiln. It's not that much of a difference in terms of how thick it is. So here we are. We've got this nice big ball of clay. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we do want to kind of see if we can get most of the little lumps and bumps out of it or the little folds out of it. And step one, when we start out this one, is we just find ourselves a nice spot on the floor that looks relatively clean. You want to find a spot that doesn't have any marks on it or doesn't have like a drain or something like that, because we want it to be nice and flat, obviously. So look for a pretty good area of concrete to be able to do this on, all right? So I'm going to take this, and the first thing, I'm going to drop it. And as soon as it drops down onto the ground, you notice that that energy from it falling, it starts to flatten out on one side, okay? You don't want to leave it sitting there for too long, because otherwise it may stick to the floor. And so I'm trying to very gently pick it up there. And so we have one flat side. Now, the next time that we put this down, I'm going to try not to go right where this circle is, because that circle right there has some moisture on it. And if I have too much moisture where I'm putting my clay, then it may potentially stick to the concrete, okay? And the next time that I go to throw it down, I have to be a little bit more careful, because I want it to fall flat like this on the ground. I don't want it to fall like this, then it's going to be like a wedge of cheese, right? So I want to kind of do this so that way I have kind of parallel planes here on the top and the bottom. And when I do it, instead of just dropping it, I'm going to kind of forcefully throw it down in the direction that I want it to go. So when I do that, if I'm way up here, I don't have a lot of control. So what I need to do is kind of get myself positioned so I'm a little bit closer to the ground. Again, not on that same spot where you see a little bit of darkness. That's drying itself out right now. I'll be able to go back to that spot later. All right, so I take this and just gently kind of throw it down with a little bit of force, right? So that way it flattens out. Now, I've got this piece that has two flat planes on it, right? Now, there are two different ways that we're going to throw this out on the ground. The first way, I call it the cherry picking way, because of those lovely things we used to do in elementary school called cherry picking, where you used to, gotta put my clay down for this, where you used to be at PE and you would go like 1, 2, 3, 1, right? Same kind of thing that I'm gonna do with this, except for we're not in PE, we're in ceramics class. I'm gonna take this like so and hold it back behind the clay, not here on the edges, back behind the clay. Bend those knees, get them down like this. Now this is dried out enough that I can go right back in that one spot. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold it up like this, and then I'm gonna throw it down this direction, but I want it to hit on the ground sideways and then roll over that way, and it'll stretch out. The other important thing when we're doing this is as I'm doing it, when I go down to the end here, I'm gonna follow through with my hands, so that way that energy follows into the clay, all right? Just like this, ready? That direction, you saw my hands continued going backwards and the clay stretched out here. Then when I lift it up, I'm gonna choose another spot, not right there, and I could just shift a little bit. I could flip the clay over as well and get another one, right? Just like that. If you hear a loud slap like that, a loud slap, that means that you're putting all the energy straight down onto the concrete, and most of the time that results in the clay sticking to the ground, all right? So we want to be careful of that. It has a nice soft sound to it, essentially. And if it hits on one edge and then starts to stretch out that way, it's that energy moving in that direction, whatever way that we were throwing it down onto the ground, and it starts to become a bigger slab. Really gentle with my fingers as I touch it, so I'm not marring up or messing up the clay surface. Man, I'm like out of breath. I feel like maybe I had too much coffee today. I don't know what happened. Just like that. And you can see it starts to get this nice, pretty consistent thickness of clay as I do that. Now, once the clay starts to get too big for me to handle with my fingers like this, I actually have to start handling it with my hands like this. And that's when I transfer over to the next kind of swing, which instead of it being the cherry picker, we're gonna be doing what I call the golf swing. And what the golf swing is it's a sideways motion. So we hold onto the clay like this, so we have a lot of nice surface area on this really thin slab of clay. And then I'm gonna back up like this, like I'm Tiger Woods, and then I'm gonna throw it down onto the ground like this, release it at the right time so it hits like this, and then stretches that direction, and follow through, right? Just like golf, keep your eye on your clay, all right? There's that wet spot that's on the ground, so I'm gonna move away from that wet spot so I'm not putting it in that exact spot. You see, most of the clay is down below my hands. That's really important. So I'm gonna back it up, and just like that, okay? And it starts to stretch in that direction. If I wanna make a long, kind of thinner slab this direction, and I wanna get some length out of it, I continue on in that direction. If I wanna put it over a piece of plaster and turn it into like a bowl or a big plate or something like that, then maybe I wanna turn it a quarter of a turn each time. So that way it continues to be round as I'm working on it. Sometimes you can interchange. I can go into that cherry picker right now even, right? It's kind of an advanced move because I've been doing it for a long time. So it's a little bit easier for me to know how hard I can actually push my fingers onto the clay without making a bunch of marks all over the clay, right? Jeff, I gotta get close to you, sorry. Right, like so, okay? And we're still going for that same thickness, right? A little bit more than a quarter of an inch, maybe a little bit thinner than 3/8 of an inch. So that way we can make a pretty decent size object. One of the beauties of slabs is that slabs enable us to make much bigger objects, much bigger than those pinch pots we started out with. So I don't want you guys to think about making really tiny little slabs like mugs. We want to think more like a vase or a flower container or something like that, all right? So that would be something that would be really good for thinking about making these slab objects. Okay, so I've got my slab down on my table. There's a couple of different things that we're gonna be doing for this project. Some of it we'll go over in class, some of it I'm gonna go over really quickly right here. So we've got basically three different things we're gonna be making for our slab project. We're gonna be making a supported form, and we're gonna be making an unsupported form, and we're gonna be making a plate or a bowl using one of the plaster molds that we have in class, all right? So I've got a couple of things here. I've got like a squared off plaster mold that's here because that's just what I'm thinking about doing. We've got square off, kind of square shaped ones. We've also got some more rounded kind of bowl shaped ones, and then we have some shallower ones if you want to make kind of a wider plate. But the technique is all going to be the same because we're going to be connecting things together. I'm going to be showing you for the supported form, I'm going to be showing you how to put this thing together without scoring and slipping anything, right? Very specific way of doing it, because if we do this right and we do it when the clay is all at the same level of dryness, then we're able to actually do this because we'll be overlapping clay and pressing and compressing into it very, very aggressively. You don't have to do it that way. There's other ways to do it where we can scratch and slip, just like we've done for our feet, for our pinch pots, or for like our deconstruction reconstruction pinch pot, where we were scratching and slipping and scratching again and pushing and wiggling, so that way we can get everything together nicely, okay? So there's just a number of different ways we can do it. So that's what I'm gonna start out with, is this supported form, which means that I've gotta have something to push against. I've got myself a pretty big cylinder that's here, and we have a few of these available in class. You can certainly bring things from home as well. And if you're bringing something from home, I would think about something like a cracker box, some sort of a snack tin, something that has straight walls, okay? Not anything that really undulates going up like this, right? Or anything that comes inwards this direction like a cone, because we want to be able to pull this thing out once we've gotten started, right? So that's why I'm using this. It's nice and straight walled, okay? Even something as what some people might think of as simple is like a soda bottle or something like a Aquafina water bottle. Those have little dips and little undulations as they go down. And so if you wrap the clay around that, you won't be able to pull that object out because of what's called an undercut. And that's the idea, where if it's a cone shaped, where it comes down this direction, right? And I have that supported form inside, and then I try and pull it out, I can't get it out because it's way too big at the bottom, right? But if we have something that's a little more V-shaped coming out this direction, then that's something I could easily pull out, right? But I want us to think more about kind of a little bit more straight-walled for now, just to make things simple for especially our supported form, right? So something like a square box, rectangular box, but not too big. If you make it too big, right, you're gonna have to make gigantic slabs to be able to go around this thing. Does that kind of make sense? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. I'm gonna change the camera angle really quickly so we can see what I'm doing down here on the table rather than being able to see me. Okay, I changed my mind a little bit. I went with a little bit wider cylinder because I saw it up on the shelf while I was filming. The only reason I'm doing that is because for what I'm gonna be making, I wanna be able to get my hand down inside a little bit better, and my hands are a little bit bigger. But that's not something that you have to be able to do, right? It's just something that I want to be able to do for the object that I'm making. Make sense? All right. So I've got my form that I'm going to be basically going around, and then I've got a piece of newspaper. We have the newspaper here in the studio just above all of our boards, and so we need to have newspaper there because even though this is a form that that's porous, which means that it's going to kind of pull away from the clay relatively easily, I want to have some sort of a barrier that's there, and just a very like a single sheet of newspaper. We don't need to go crazy and have a whole bunch of newspaper, right? So I've got this smallish kind of piece of newspaper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to wrap it around my form like so. The form's really long, but I'm not going to use the entirety of the form. I'm just going to use this lower part. And when I wrap this around the form, it's kind of like wrapping a package, but you know, sometimes or a lot of times when we're wrapping packages, we want them to be nice and tight and look really pretty, right? So we'll take this part and we'll tape it down to the package. Don't do that, right? What we want to do is just wrap this loosely, not super loose, but loose enough around this form. And then I'm going to take a piece of tape and I'm going to tape this part. And the reason why I don't want to tape it to the form is because I want to be able to pull the form out, and this newspaper is going to be a barrier so that as I pull the form out, it keeps everything together, but it's not stuck to the form itself, right? So I get just a couple of pieces of tape. I've got tape in the studio for us to be able to use. And so if you look at this slides nicely on the form. That's what we want to be able to have happen, right? Okay, so I have actually cut this, and I've cut this using a straight edge. This is going to be the bottom of the piece. This is going to be the top of the piece. I left that natural edge there. You don't have to leave the natural edge. That's completely up to you as the maker. But then I want to have relatively 90-degree walls on the sides here where that overlap is going to happen. And so remember what I did to try and find out how long this needed to be was I kind of used my finger and just held it on the form, and then I kept that on the form where it was to make sure it went all the way around, and then I want about at least an inch past that in order to get this to the right level, right? We can straighten off the top if we want to. That's completely up to you guys, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that clay and I'm going to lift it up, and I'm going to have it so that it, comes in and is supported on that form. And then I'm going to come all the way over until it kind of touches down below. I've got to adjust it just ever so slightly to make sure it matches. There we go. And then I'm going to kind of just do that and roll it over onto the clay so it sticks the clay And then if I roll it back this direction, then all of that is nice and together, okay? It's overlapped about a 1/2 inch to about 3/4 of an inch the way it actually turned out. It's okay if it's an inch, but we don't want to go 2 inches, 3 inches. That's way too much, all right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very rigid piece of clay, and we can also use our stamps. We're going to be making stamps in class actually today while I'm filming, after I'm done filming this. And then we're going to get those fired so that we can turn them into bisqueware, which is the first firing stage. So that way you guys can actually use these stamps in the making of your slab objects, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this rigid object, right, whatever it happens to be, and I'm going to start pushing in and zippering this up all the way up this whole area, aggressively pushing down into it. But I don't want to push down in so hard that it actually touches the form. So I've got to be careful, right? And the other thing that I can't do as I'm doing this is I can't push in, what was I going to say? Oh, I can't leave too much space between each one of the stamps. If I have too much space in between each one of the stamps, then it's not going to work out. Right? You don't want to, I'm leaving like less than 1/8 of an inch in between each one of these stamps. And what I'm now doing, if you think about that,
yeah, I don't know if it might have stopped. Did it?
It's good. So what I'm getting here is I'm starting to get this repetitive pattern, right? So if you have multiple stamps, you can kind of stamp, and then change your stamp to another one, and then stamp, and then change to another. So you can get some sort of a repetitive pattern going up there. Or you can use the exact same stamp going up the entirety, right? And one of the nice things about doing this when we're doing this with the supported form is that the form that's down inside of it is holding everything together for us. So it holds it together nicely. And I'm not also pushing so hard that it's squishing all this down and thinning out that part that's touching the table right now. So you'll notice that I'm holding the form with my hand as well. All right, all the way up to the tip top. So I've zippered that whole thing up. And I'll lift it up just slightly so the camera can see a little bit more, but you can see how close together each one of those stamps are. And then I really like what happens here from doing that stamp. It kind of pushes the clay over this way. So instead of it being this cut portion, I start to see this wiggliness that's there that I kind of like, a little bit more of like a natural-ish edge. All right, so I'm going to keep that on the form for now. And what I'm going to do is I've got myself a board, all right? I'm going to grab a piece of newspaper as well. This can be a little bit thicker piece of newspaper. Just like one single sheet of newspaper, but then fold it up like so, all right, to be able to put it on. And I've got myself a piece of clay that's big enough for my base, that's overly big enough for my base. So I set that down on my board, and I'm going to take this object, and I'm going to very gently set it on there using this nice supported form, right, to keep everything together. Now, one thing I'm not going to do, I've got to like peek around it like a tree or something, is I'm not going to apply pressure from the top. If I apply pressure from the top of this thing, it's going to act like a cookie cutter, and it's going to start to cut down into the clay that's down below, right? So we don't want to have that to happen. So I just gingerly place it on there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my knife tool again, and I'm going to cut around here. But I'm going to cut around and leave myself about at least 3/4 of an inch, maybe about an inch, no more than an inch around, okay? If it's more than an inch, it's too much of an overlap. And with too much of an overlap, we run the risk of potentially trapping air when we're doing this thing, when we're putting it all together, all right? So, and it doesn't have to be perfect, right? And again, we can save some of this clay because maybe we want to use it for something else later, okay? So now I've got this overlap that's happening here, right? We can see that zippered up bit happening. And now what I'm going to do, I looked and saw I've got a spot that looks a little bit too wide for what it is that I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm going to pull that in a little bit so I don't have too much of an overlap. Everything else looks pretty good. And now I could take this and fold it up with no scratching and slipping at all. I'm just going to kind of fold it up this way like so. Now if I wanted to, I could have something like this, right? Where I kind of lift it up with just my fingers and keep it like that. I could do that. But then if I wanted to connect those two together, I'd have to scratch and slip, right? Because I've not applied any of that pressure like I did to the front part here, right? When I zippered it up. I'm going to actually apply a bunch of pressure using the stick, the same stick that I used to do the stamp on this one, right? And you can use a stick. You could also use your stamp, and you could stamp into that depending on the size of your stamp, right? But I'm going to take this and I'm going to do this little bit of a fold technique that I like to do, which is where I just kind of press that clay pretty aggressively into that part. And that overlap and that compression and the wet stickiness of the clay that's happening right now, that's actually going to help keep this object together without having to score and slip. If this is too dry, and we don't have that fresh out of the bag feel, then it's not going to work out properly, okay? If we don't get the right compression, and we don't actually compress into there and have a good overlap, then that won't work either, or it won't stay together, right? So now I'm going to come here, and I'm just going to keep doing this around the entire object. And it thins it out a little bit. That's another reason why I went back and kind of made it a little bit smaller than it was, because it was a little bit too long. It would have come up this direction too much, and those proportions wouldn't have looked right, because essentially what this is doing is this is creating a foot. But it's creating a visual foot rather than a physical foot that's lifting it up off the table. And the nice thing about having this on a piece of newspaper is I could shift it over if I can't quite get to the clay. I can just pull it over using the newspaper rather than having to lift this object up and then move it over physically, right? This thing will allow me to scoot it anywhere on the board. And it's overlapped. The newspaper is overlapped. It's a few sheets of newspaper, not just a single newspaper. If it was a single one, that'd be too difficult. All right, so there we go. We've got that thing buttoned up this direction. We've got it overlapped down below, has that kind of visual foot that's going on, okay? And so that's the beginning of this. Then what we do with this afterwards, when we're ready to take the form out, is that I could just take this and very gently pull it out. Notice that the newspaper didn't come with it because the newspaper wasn't so tight. And the newspaper is kind of sticking to the clay a little bit in there. And then to get the newspaper out, all I'm going to do is reach in there and grab the newspaper and kind of pick it up. And if I pull this kind of low-tack tape off, if it doesn't stick too badly or if it doesn't destroy the newspaper too bad, this newspaper can get reused. Anytime we're in the studio and we can try and reuse stuff, we want to do that, right? This is not a bad piece of newspaper yet. It just has to dry out a little bit, right? So this can be flattened back out and we can reuse that, all right? So that's kind of how we go from there. I'm probably going to come back and make some changes here so I don't have this really sharp edge that's going on. So I potentially could cut that. There's a lot of different things I could do. I could flare out the rim and have it kind of stretch outwards like this. I could completely flatten it out. I could also cut another long strip and put another long strip around here and double up the thickness of the rim to make that a nice visual rim. That thickness adds to kind of the strength, if you will, of the visual strength, not the physical strength of the rim shape itself, right? It's just all up to you as to what you want to do as the maker, right? I could also reach my hand down inside of this and I can use one of my stamps and I could stamp directly into this piece, right? The other thing that I could do is I could take a piece of clay. Let's say that, little hypothetical, this is the wall of our object, right? Another thing that I could do is I could take a piece of clay like so, and maybe even like kind of thin it out a little bit. Or I could thin out the entirety of I can actually throw, just like I'm throwing on the ground, I could throw it on the table to thin it out, make it nice and a much thinner sheet. Not quite paper thin, but pretty thin, all right? Then I could cut whatever it is close to the size of the stamp that I'm going to be using. And this is a technique that we call applique. It's spelled like Applique, if I'm not mistaken. Think about back in the day when they used to make, when they used to seal envelopes with a stamp and the the kind of liquid wax, right? They drip the wax on there, and then when it's at the right temperature, they would squeeze it down in there, and it would basically squeeze out like that. That's essentially what applique is, right? So I'm going to take this. This is the wall of my piece, remember? This is the piece I'm going to stick on. If I need to, I can add a little bit of moisture there, not a lot. Don't spray it with a spray bottle. A tiny amount, like a drop or less of water, right? If you're doing it and it's wet clay, you almost don't even need to scratch or anything. But if it's drier clay and you're putting a wetter object on, then you would need to scratch, slip, scratch again, push and wiggle these things together. That's a necessary thing to do. But it's not that way. It's pretty wet right now. So if I take that and stick it on, and then I take something like my stamp, made that a little bit too wide. I just want it to kind of extend out a little bit. And then if I take this stamp and push the stamp down into it, it kind of squeezes out this way and gives it a nice kind of fun thing. So that could be like something added to the side of a piece, right? As something visual that's, instead of it just being a straight up and down object, it has some different silhouette. If we were to like, you know, right now it's just straight. It's something to break up that silhouette to give it some interest. And then when we glaze our objects, glaze can kind of hang inside of here and hang inside of the stamp and make it potentially look really interesting, right? And we can just figure out how we're going to place those onto the outside of our object if that's what we want to do. Some of you may want it to just be like this, right? You could also, when it's wet, reach in and you could stretch things out and make things push out and make things push in, right? That's all up to you. I could come over the entirety of this object and I can squeeze in over and over and over again to make it have a little bit more of a column feel, right? Or if I use a rounded piece like a dowel, then I can make it look so this whole object is like scalloped from the top to the bottom. That could be interesting, right? So many different things to do. I want you guys to use that creative brain and think about how you can make something a little bit different than what I just made, right? Because I don't want you guys making the exact things that I'm making, but I want you guys making things using the processes that I'm showing you. Make sense? All right, have fun with this.